11 silver dots pierce the morning haze above the Philippine Sea. They're falling fast, diving through 20,000 feet in a coordinated attack formation that's been perfected through 3 years of Pacific warfare. Zero fighters, the most feared aircraft in the theater, each one flown by a pilot handpicked from the Emperor's finest squadrons. Below them, a single F6F Hellcat banks hard left, alone, outnumbered, seemingly trapped. The Zeros smell blood. Their lead pilot adjusts trim, tightens his formation. Standard doctrine calls for a classic bounce. Dive fast, fire from astern, break away before the enemy can respond. It's worked 1,000 times before against American fighters. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But as the range closes to 800 yards, something impossible happens. The lone Hellcat doesn't run. It doesn't climb. Instead, it does something that violates every principle of air combat doctrine. It turns directly toward the diving Zeros. 11 against 1. Head on. At a closure rate of 600 miles per hour. What happens next will last exactly 90 seconds. When it's over, 11 Zeros will be falling toward the Pacific. Burning. Broken. Gone. The pilot of that Hellcat has never fired his guns in anger before this moment. He's 22 years old. His squadron mates call him the Professor. Behind his back, they call him worse things. He's about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in warfare isn't courage or experience or even skill. Sometimes it's mathematics. This is the Philippine Sea, June 1944. The greatest carrier battle in naval history is about to begin. Task Force 58 churns westward through swells the size of buildings. The horizon bristles with masts and radar antennae. 68 ships, 15 aircraft carriers, 900 combat aircraft. It's the largest naval force ever assembled, and it's hunting. The Japanese combined fleet is coming to meet them. 6 carriers, 13 battleships, the finest pilots the Empire can muster. The clash, when it comes, will decide the fate of the Pacific War. But first, 200 miles ahead of the main force, lone scouts probe the empty ocean. Hellcats and Zeros dance at the edge of radar coverage, testing, probing, reporting. Most encounters last seconds. A brief glimpse, a radio call, then silence as pilots race back to their carriers with intelligence. This encounter will be different. The morning patrol launched at 0600. 2 sections, for Hellcats, assigned to sweep the northwestern search sector. Routine reconnaissance. Find the enemy fleet, report position, avoid engagement. Fighter sweeps would come later, when the big ships were in gun range. Section leader was Lieutenant Commander Jack Hayes. 26 years old, 17 kills, aggressive pilot with political aspirations and an instinct for headline-grabbing heroics. His wingman, Lieutenant Pete Morrison, was cut from the same cloth. Quick trigger finger, quicker mouth, the kind of pilot who measured success in confirmed kills and Purple Hearts. The second section flew loose formation 3 miles to starboard. Section leader was Lieutenant J.G. Robert Chun, fresh from training command, quiet, methodical, prone to asking too many questions during briefings. His wingman was the one they called the Professor. Ensign David Kellerman. 5 feet 8 inches tall, 140 pounds soaking wet, wire-rimmed glasses under his flight goggles. He looked like he belonged in a university lecture hall, not a fighter cockpit. Which is exactly where he'd been 18 months earlier, teaching applied mathematics at Princeton University before Pearl Harbor changed everything. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. The Philippine Sea in June 1944 is not romantic. It smells of diesel fuel and rotting seaweed, of superheated metal and men who haven't seen fresh water in weeks. The humidity hangs like wet wool, thick enough to taste. Carriers cut through swells that stretch to every horizon, leaving wakes that disappear behind them into gray-green nothing. This is the Mariana Campaign. The Americans are pushing west, island by island, atoll by atoll, grinding toward the Japanese home islands. Saipan, Guam, Tinian, names that mean nothing to most Americans, but everything to Japanese strategic planners. These islands guard the approaches to the Philippines. If they fall, the Empire's southern defensive perimeter collapses. Admiral Raymond Spruance commands Task Force 58 from the flag bridge of USS Indianapolis. His mission is simple in concept, brutal in execution: Destroy the Japanese mobile fleet before it can interfere with the amphibious landings on Saipan. Find them, fix them, sink them. The Japanese plan is equally direct. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet will sortie from Taitoi, rendezvous with land-based aircraft from Guam and the Philippines, then crush the American invasion force in a single decisive battle. They call it Operation Ego, the last throw of the dice. But between planning and execution lies the gray zone of air patrol, where single aircraft probe and parry, where intelligence is gathered in fragments, where one radio call can shift the balance of an entire campaign. Fighter doctrine in 1944 is crystallized violence. Energy fighting. Altitude equals life. Speed is everything. The pilot with superior position, higher, faster, better positioned, dictates the engagement. The Hellcat was designed around this principle. Heavy, powerful, capable of diving fast and climbing away. Built for pilots who understood energy management and used it like a weapon. The Zero was built around different assumptions. Light, maneuverable, capable of turning inside anything the Allies could put in the air. In 1942, this made it nearly invincible. Zero pilots had perfected the art of the turning fight, drawing American aircraft into slow-speed dogfights where Japanese superiority was absolute. But by 1944, American pilots had learned. They fought vertically, not horizontally. They used the Hellcat's strengths, power, diving speed, armor, and avoided its weaknesses. They had discipline. They followed doctrine. Most of them. The reality of carrier aviation is that combat happens at the margins. Fuel is always limited. Weather is always worse than forecast. Enemy contact comes when you least expect it, in configurations that weren't covered in training. Doctrine provides the framework, but survival depends on adaptation. Some pilots adapt better than others. David Kellerman grew up in Pasadena, California, in a house that smelled of pipe tobacco and differential equations. His father was a mechanical engineer at Caltech, his mother a high school mathematics teacher. Dinner conversations revolved around stress analysis and trajectory calculations. By age 12, David could derive the equations of motion for a pendulum. By 15, he was auditing graduate-level physics courses. He wasn't athletic. He read instead of playing baseball. He built radio receivers instead of dating. His high school yearbook listed his activities as math club, chess club, physics club. The quote under his senior picture read, "There is geometry in the humming of the strings." Princeton University offered him a full scholarship in 1938. He completed his bachelor's degree in mathematics in 3 years, then stayed for graduate work in applied dynamics. His doctoral thesis explored the ballistics of anti-aircraft fire, how to calculate intercept angles for moving targets at varying altitudes and speeds. It was pure mathematics applied to very practical problems. When the war started, David was 21 years old, teaching undergraduate calculus and working as a research assistant in the aeronautical engineering department. He had never been in an airplane. He had never fired a gun. But he understood the mathematics of flight better than most pilots understood their own aircraft. The Navy came recruiting in early 1943. They needed pilots, thousands of them, fast. The selection criteria were broad: physical fitness, emotional stability, basic intelligence. David passed the physical exam barely. His vision was correctable to 20/20, his reflexes adequate, his coordination marginal. The psychological evaluation was more problematic. "Why do you want to fly combat aircraft, Kellerman?" "I don't, sir. I want to understand the mathematics of air combat." "This isn't a research project, son. This is war." "Yes, sir. I understand. But war is applied mathematics at lethal speeds." The examiner stared at him for a long moment, then stamped his application. Accepted. Flight training was a revelation. Not because David was naturally gifted. He wasn't. His stick and rudder skills were adequate at best. He couldn't dogfight worth a damn. But he understood what was happening. When other cadets flew by instinct, David flew by calculation. He knew exactly how much altitude he traded for speed in a dive. He could predict the turning radius of his aircraft at any given airspeed. He understood load factors and angle of attack, and why some maneuvers worked while others got you killed. His instructors didn't know what to make of him. He asked questions that made them think. Why do we always attack from high and behind? What if the geometry was different? What if the engagement envelope could be shifted? Most instructors told him to shut up and follow doctrine. A few listened. One, a grizzled former airline pilot named Lieutenant Commander Harrison, took him aside after a particularly intense training flight. "Kellerman, you're never going to be a natural stick-and-rudder man. But you think about this stuff differently than anyone I've taught. Don't lose that. The war's going to need pilots who can think as well as fly." David graduated from flight training ranked 15th out of 32 in his class. Not bad, not great. His shooting was mediocre. His formation flying was adequate. But his navigation was flawless, and his aircraft handling was precise as clockwork. He understood his machine. Assignment to VF-8 aboard USS Bunker Hill came with a reputation. The squadron had a reputation for aggressive, experienced pilots who flew by instinct and fought by feel. David fit in like a slide rule in a boxing ring. Squadron commander was Lieutenant Commander William Dean, a veteran of Guadalcanal with 12 confirmed kills and a temper to match his reputation. He looked at David's service record and shook his head. A college professor. Jesus Christ. What's next, kindergarten teachers? David's first flight with the squadron was a disaster. Formation flying, basic tactics, gunnery practice. He kept precise position, followed every procedure, hit the target with mathematical consistency. His squadron mates were unimpressed. "Hey, professor, you gonna calculate the zeros to death?" Maybe he can lecture them into submission. "I heard he's never even been in a fight. What's he gonna do when the shooting starts?" David said nothing. He logged flight hours, studied aircraft performance data, and calculated. Always calculating. Turn rates, climb angles, energy exchange ratios. He filled notebook after notebook with equations and diagrams, trying to model air combat mathematically. The other pilots thought he was obsessed. They weren't wrong. 6 weeks into deployment, VF-8 flew its first combat mission, a fighter sweep over truck. David flew as wingman to Lieutenant Morrison, 4th in a 4-plane division. The mission was routine until it wasn't. 8 zeros bounced them out of the sun. Morrison called the break. 4 Hellcats scattered, each pilot fighting his own private war. David's war lasted about 30 seconds. He followed Morrison through a climbing turn, lost sight of him in the confusion, found himself alone with a 0 on his tail. Standard doctrine was clear. Use power and altitude to extend away from the enemy. Regroup with friendly aircraft. Engage with advantage. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. David did exactly that. He rolled into a dive, used his Hellcat's superior power to pull away from the 0, climbed back to altitude, and rejoined the fight. The engagement was over by the time he returned. 2 zeros down, no American losses. Morrison claimed 1 kill. Haze claimed the other. In the debrief, nobody mentioned David's performance. He hadn't shot down any aircraft. He hadn't even fired his guns. He'd simply survived, which in the Pacific theater was sometimes victory enough. But David had learned something during those 30 seconds. The 0 pilot had followed him into the dive, then given up the pursuit when his aircraft couldn't match the Hellcat's diving speed. The disengagement point had been predictable, calculable. The 0's power-to-weight ratio limited its diving performance. Its structural design imposed constraints on maneuvering at high speed. David went back to his notebooks. He started calculating the performance envelope not just of his own aircraft, but of the enemy's. Turn rates, climb angles, diving speeds, structural limits. He studied captured 0 manuals, intelligence reports, gun camera footage. He built a mathematical model of Japanese fighter tactics. His squadron mates thought he was wasting his time. "You don't beat zeros with slide rules, professor. Combat's about instinct, not equations. All the math in the world won't help when you're pulling G's with a 0 on your 6. David nodded politely and kept calculating. He understood something his squadron mates didn't. They saw air combat as art, as instinct, as the indefinable magic of pilot skill. He saw it as applied physics, energy states, vector analysis, probability theory, and physics, properly applied, was absolutely ruthless. By June 1944, the myth of 0 invincibility was officially dead, but the aircraft remained dangerous in the right hands. Japanese pilot quality had declined since 1942. The veteran aviators of Pearl Harbor and the early campaigns were mostly gone, killed, or grounded. their places taken by hastily trained replacements. But the ones who remained, the survivors of 3 years of Pacific fighting, were deadly. The Zero's fundamental design philosophy hadn't changed. Lightweight construction, extraordinary maneuverability, range that seemed impossible given its size. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could still turn inside anything the Americans flew. The problem was that most engagements no longer came down to turning fights. American fighter doctrine emphasized energy tactics. Height equals life. Speed is armor. Engage on your terms, or don't engage at all. The Hellcat was built to this doctrine. Heavy, powerful, fast in a dive, capable of climbing away from trouble. American pilots who followed doctrine usually survived. Those who didn't often didn't. But doctrine assumed rational opponents. It assumed that Japanese pilots would behave predictably, that they would follow their own tactical manual, that they would engage in ways that played to American strengths. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. The problem manifested most clearly in what intelligence analysts called ambush scenarios. Single Hellcats, separated from formation, caught by superior numbers of Japanese fighters. Doctrine called for immediate disengagement, dive away, use power advantage, extend to safety. Most of the time it worked. When it didn't work, American pilots died. The loss reports told the story in bureaucratic language. Aircraft lost to enemy action. Pilot reported missing. Last radio contact at 0847 hours. But behind each report was a tactical problem that doctrine couldn't solve. What do you do when disengagement isn't possible? David had been studying the problem for months, analyzing combat reports, gun camera footage, intelligence summaries. The pattern was consistent. Hellcats caught alone by multiple Japanese fighters had 3 options: fight and probably die, run and possibly die, or surrender the initiative and definitely die. The mathematics of multiple aircraft engagements were brutal. 1 American fighter versus 2 Japanese fighters represented a theoretical disadvantage that could be overcome with superior pilot skill or favorable positioning. 1 versus 3 was significantly worse. 1 versus 4 or more was generally considered hopeless. But the calculations assumed that all aircraft engaged simultaneously, that the Japanese fighters could coordinate their attacks effectively, that they could bring their numbers to bear efficiently. David suspected that assumption was flawed. He'd been analyzing gun camera footage from recent engagements, studying the geometry of multiple aircraft combat. What he found was chaos. Even well-trained pilots had difficulty coordinating attacks against a single target. Formation integrity broke down rapidly in a turning fight. Communication became fragmented. Individual aircraft maneuvered independently, often getting in each other's way. The phenomenon was most pronounced in head-on attacks. When multiple fighters attacked a single target from the front hemisphere, the geometry became incredibly complex. Closure rates were high. Time to target was short. Each attacking pilot had to calculate not just his own approach angle, but avoid collisions with other attacking aircraft. David started sketching geometric models. Attack angles, convergence zones, mutual interference patterns. What emerged was a mathematical revelation. There was a specific approach geometry that maximized mutual interference among attacking aircraft while minimizing their collective firing effectiveness. The key was deflection angle. Most pilots thought of air combat in terms of pursuit curves, getting behind the enemy and staying there. But pursuit curves weren't the only option. Head-on attacks were possible, though generally discouraged because of the high closure rates and brief firing windows. David calculated something different. Not a head-on attack, but an oblique approach at a specific angle that would force attacking aircraft into conflicting flight paths. If the geometry was correct, multiple attackers would interfere with each other's firing solutions. They would mask each other's guns. They would be forced to maneuver defensively to avoid mid-air collisions. The math was elegant. The practical application was terrifying. It required flying directly toward multiple enemy aircraft at a precisely calculated angle. The margin for error was minimal. The timing had to be perfect. And if the calculations were wrong, the pilot attempting the maneuver would be flying into a concentrated crossfire with no escape route. David filled 3 notebooks with calculations. Approach angles, deflection rates, mutual interference zones, energy transfer equations. He modeled different scenarios, varying numbers of attackers, different attack geometries, various approach speeds and altitudes. The results were consistent. Under specific conditions, a single aircraft could disrupt the attack coordination of multiple opponents through precise positioning and timing. The key was understanding the geometry of the engagement and exploiting the mathematical relationships between attack angles and mutual interference. David wasn't thinking about this as a combat maneuver. He was thinking about it as applied mathematics, a theoretical solution to a multi-body dynamics problem. The fact that the bodies in question were fighter aircraft carrying live ammunition was secondary to the elegant mathematical relationships he'd discovered. He never discussed his calculations with his squadron mates. They already thought he was obsessed with useless theory. And the maneuver he derived wasn't just theoretical. It was suicidal unless executed with absolute precision. The difference between mathematical perfection and mathematical catastrophe was measured in degrees and milliseconds. But as VF-8 prepared for the largest carrier battle in naval history, David kept his notebooks close. Mathematics had a way of becoming practical when survival was at stake. The war was about to provide the ultimate test of his equations. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.